Every night at exactly 9 o'clock, the wildest saloon in Colorado territory would fall into complete silence. Not because of violence or fear, but because a man who couldn't speak was saying things with his piano that no one had ever heard before. And what those melodies were really doing to people's minds would shake the foundations of the frontier itself. But to understand how Matthias Cole became the most powerful man in Dusty Creek without ever speaking a single word, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to a childhood tragedy that robbed him of his voice, but gave him something far more dangerous in return. Matthias Cole was born in 1851 in a small farming community outside Denver, the only child of Heinrich and Martha Cole, German immigrants who had come west seeking the promise of free land and new opportunities. Heinrich was a skilled carpenter who built some of the finest furniture in the territory, while Martha was known for her beautiful singing voice that could fill their small wooden church with such pure, haunting melodies that grown men would weep openly during Sunday services. From his earliest memories, Matthias was surrounded by music and craftsmanship. His father would work in his shop with a steady rhythm of hammer and saw, while his mother would sing German lullabies that seemed to make even the wildest prairie storms calm down and listen. The boy showed early signs of inheriting both parents' gifts. He could carve intricate patterns in wood by age 6, and he hummed melodies that were somehow more complex and beautiful than anything his mother had taught him. But when Matthias was 8 years old, everything changed in a single night of horror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A group of claim jumpers had been terrorizing the area for weeks, driving families off their land through violence and intimidation. The Cole family had received warnings to abandon their farm, but Heinrich was a stubborn man who believed that hard work and righteousness would protect his family from evil. He was wrong. They came on a moonless night in October 1859, 6 armed men who surrounded the Cole cabin and demanded that the family leave immediately or face the consequences. Heinrich tried to reason with them, offering to share his land or pay them money to leave his family in peace. But the claim jumpers weren't interested in compromise. They wanted the Coles gone permanently, and they were willing to use terror to achieve their goal. When Heinrich refused to abandon the home he'd built with his own hands, the men decided to make an example that would discourage other families in the area from resisting their demands. They forced the family outside at gunpoint, then doused the cabin with kerosene and set it ablaze while the Coles watched everything they owned turn to ash and smoke. But burning the cabin wasn't enough for the claim jumpers. Their leader, a cold-eyed killer named Jake Brennan, decided that the family needed to learn what happened to people who defied his orders. He grabbed 8-year-old Matthias and held a knife to the boy's throat while the other men restrained his parents. "You want to keep your boy?" Brennan asked Heinrich with a smile that belonged in hell. "Then you're going to watch what happens to people who don't listen." What happened next would replay in Matthias's nightmares for decades. Brennan forced the boy to watch as his men tortured and murdered both of his parents in ways that were designed to maximize suffering rather than simply end life. Martha's beautiful singing voice was silenced forever, and Heinrich's skilled hands would never craft another piece of furniture. When the killing was finished, Brennan turned his attention back to Matthias. The boy was in shock, unable to cry or scream, or even fully comprehend what he had witnessed. Brennan grabbed him by the throat and squeezed until the child's vision began to blur. "You saw what happens to families who don't do what they're told," Brennan whispered. "Now you're going to tell everyone in the territory what happened here. You're going to be our messenger boy." But when Brennan released his grip and demanded that Matthias speak, nothing happened. The trauma of watching his parents die had stolen the boy's voice as completely as if his vocal cords had been cut with a blade. He opened his mouth and tried to form words, but only silence emerged. Brennan was furious at being denied his messenger, but he had no use for a mute child who couldn't spread the terror he wanted to create. The claim jumpers left Matthias alone among the ashes of his home and the bodies of his parents, assuming that an 8-year-old boy wouldn't survive long in the wilderness without help. They were wrong about that, too. Matthias was found 3 days later by a traveling preacher named Reverend Thomas Whitmore, who was making his monthly circuit through the scattered settlements of Colorado Territory. The boy was unconscious from hunger and exposure, but he was alive. More importantly, he was clutching something in his small hands that would change the course of his life forever. Among the ruins of the coal cabin, Matthias had found a partially burned music box that had belonged to his mother. The delicate mechanism was damaged, but still functional, and it played a haunting melody that seemed to possess an otherworldly quality. When Reverend Whitmore wound the key and let the music play, he felt something strange happen in his mind, a sense of peace and clarity that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The Reverend took Matthias to the nearest town, hoping to find someone who could care for the traumatized boy. But the child's muteness and the horrific story of his parents' murder made most families reluctant to take him in. People were afraid that the claimed jumpers might return to finish what they'd started, and they didn't want to risk their own children's lives for the sake of an orphaned boy who couldn't even speak. It was the town's piano teacher, an elderly widow named Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, who finally agreed to give Matthias a home. Mrs. Hutchins had been teaching music for over 40 years, and she recognized something special in the boy's relationship with his mother's damaged music box. When she played simple melodies on her piano, Matthias would respond with complex harmonies that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Under Mrs. Hutchins' patient guidance, Matthias discovered that while he couldn't speak with his voice, he could communicate through music in ways that were far more powerful than ordinary words. By age 10, he could play piano with a skill that surpassed many professional musicians. By 12, he was composing melodies that seemed to affect listeners on an emotional level that bordered on the supernatural. But there was something different about Matthias's music, something that went beyond normal artistic ability. When he played certain combinations of notes and rhythms, people would find their thoughts and emotions changing in ways they couldn't explain. A sad melody could bring grown men to tears. An angry piece could make peaceful people feel violent urges. Most mysteriously, some of his compositions seemed to make listeners completely forget their troubles and enter a state of trance-like calm. Mrs. Hutchins initially assumed that Matthias's unusual effects on audiences were simply the result of exceptional talent and the emotional power of his tragic history. But as the boy grew older and his abilities became more pronounced, she began to suspect that something supernatural was at work. People who heard Matthias play would often report strange dreams and visions. Some claimed that his music allowed them to communicate with deceased loved ones. Others said that listening to his piano had cured them of various ailments and psychological problems. The truth was even more remarkable than Mrs. Hutchins imagined. The trauma that had stolen Matthias's voice had also awakened a psychic ability that allowed him to influence human consciousness through musical vibrations. The melodies he played were somehow attuned to the natural frequencies of the human brain, enabling him to manipulate thoughts, emotions, and even memories through carefully constructed musical phrases. Matthias himself didn't fully understand his gift during his teenage years. He only knew that when he sat at the piano and let his fingers find the keys, he could make people feel whatever he wanted them to feel. More importantly, he discovered that he could use his music to prevent violence and cruelty, the same forces that had destroyed his family. The first time Matthias consciously used his ability to stop violence was in 1868, when he was 17 years old. A group of drunken cowboys had cornered Mrs. Hutchins outside the general store and were threatening her because she had refused to give piano lessons to one of their friends who had been making inappropriate advances toward her female students. The situation was escalating toward physical violence when Matthias appeared. Unable to speak in his own defense or Mrs. Hutchins, Matthias did the only thing he could. He began to hum one of his compositions. The melody was soft and simple, but it carried an irresistible power that immediately diffused the cowboys' anger. Within minutes, they were apologizing to Mrs. Hutchins and offering to help her carry her groceries home. They walked away confused about why they had been angry in the first place, but completely convinced that they had been wrong to threaten the elderly piano teacher. That incident taught Matthias that his gift could be used as a tool for justice and protection. Over the following years, he began experimenting with different musical techniques that could produce specific psychological effects. He learned to compose melodies that could calm violent impulses, inspire feelings of guilt in people who had committed wrongdoing, and even implant suggestions that would motivate listeners to confess their crimes or make amends for their actions. By 1871, Matthias had outgrown the small town where Mrs. Hutchins lived, and he felt called to use his abilities in places where they would have the greatest impact on reducing suffering and injustice. He decided to travel to Dusty Creek, Colorado, a notorious mining town where violence and lawlessness were endemic. If he could bring peace to a place like Dusty Creek, he reasoned he could prove that his gift was powerful enough to make a real difference in the world. Dusty Creek in 1871 was everything Matthias had expected and worse. The town existed to serve the hundreds of miners who worked the silver deposits in the surrounding mountains, and it was a place where might made right. Disputes were settled with guns, and human life was valued less than the precious metals that drove the local economy. The main street was lined with saloons, gambling houses, and brothels, all operating under the protection of corrupt officials who took their cut of the profits in exchange for looking the other way. The Crimson Rose Saloon was the largest and most notorious establishment in Dusty Creek, a three-story building that housed a saloon on the ground floor, gambling rooms on the second floor, and private quarters for the working girls on the third floor. The saloon was owned by a man named Victor Blackwood, who controlled most of the illegal activities in town through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and violence. Blackwood employed a small army of gunmen who ensured that his interests were protected and his competitors were eliminated. When Matthias arrived in Dusty Creek, he quickly realized that conventional approaches to reducing violence and corruption would be useless in a place where the sheriff was on Blackwood's payroll and honest citizens were too intimidated to speak out against injustice. But his musical abilities offered a different approach, one that could work on the psychological level to change hearts and minds rather than simply suppressing criminal behavior through force. Matthias approached Victor Blackwood with a simple proposition. He would play piano in the Crimson Rose Saloon in exchange for room and board. He communicated his request through written notes, explaining that he was a mute musician who could provide entertainment that would keep customers calm and happy. Blackwood was initially skeptical, but he agreed to give Matthias a trial period after hearing him play a few songs that left the saloon owner feeling unusually peaceful and generous. What Blackwood didn't realize was that he had just hired the most dangerous man in Colorado territory, someone whose weapon was so subtle and powerful that its effects would be virtually impossible to detect or counter. Matthias began playing at the Crimson Rose Saloon on a Monday evening in September 1871. His first performance was carefully calculated to establish a routine that would allow him to gradually increase his influence over the saloon's patrons without arousing suspicion. He played familiar songs and popular tunes, but he subtly modified the melodies and rhythms to produce calming effects that reduced the likelihood of fights and violence. The results were immediate and remarkable. Within a week of Matthias's arrival, the number of brawls in the Crimson Rose dropped by more than half. Gamblers who had previously been quick to draw guns over disputed hands were now settling their differences with words rather than weapons. Even the working girls reported that their customers were treating them with more respect and kindness than they had experienced in years. But Matthias was just getting started. As the weeks passed, he began introducing more sophisticated musical techniques that could produce deeper psychological changes in his listeners. He learned to identify the emotional and moral vulnerabilities of individual patrons, then play compositions that would speak directly to their consciences and better angels. A man who had been planning to cheat at cards would suddenly decide that honest play was more satisfying. A customer who had been considering robbing a fellow miner would find himself overcome with empathy for his intended victim. Men who had come to the saloon looking for fights would leave feeling ashamed of their violent impulses and determined to find peaceful ways to resolve their conflicts. The transformation of the Crimson Rose Saloon did not go unnoticed by the rest of Dusty Creek. Other saloon owners began complaining that they were losing customers to Blackwood's establishment, not because of better liquor or prettier girls, but because people seemed to prefer the strange atmosphere that had developed since the mute piano player had started performing. Sheriff Morrison, who depended on fines and bribes from saloon fights to supplement his income, became concerned about the dramatic reduction in arrests and citations. But the most significant reaction came from the miners themselves. Men who had been living hard, violent lives suddenly found themselves questioning their choices and seeking ways to improve their behavior. Church attendance increased dramatically as people felt compelled to seek spiritual guidance for problems they had never recognized before. The town's doctor reported a sharp decrease in injuries from fights and accidents, while the local preacher found himself counseling an unprecedented number of people who wanted to confess their sins and change their ways. What was happening at the Crimson Rose Saloon every night at 9 o'clock was nothing less than mass psychological manipulation through musical hypnosis. Matthias had learned to use his piano as a tool for reaching into the deepest parts of human consciousness and adjusting the moral settings that govern behavior and decision-making. He was essentially reprogramming the minds of everyone who heard his music, turning violent men into peaceful ones and corrupt individuals into honest citizens. The most dramatic demonstration of Matthias's power came in February 1872, when tensions between two rival mining crews erupted into open warfare that threatened to destroy the entire town. The Sullivan crew and the O'Brien crew had been feuding for months over disputed claims and perceived insults, and their conflict had escalated to the point where both sides were talking about settling the matter with a massive gunfight that would leave dozens of men dead. The planned showdown was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in the main street of Dusty Creek, with most of the town's population choosing sides or preparing to flee for their lives. Sheriff Morrison had made it clear that he would not intervene in what he considered a legitimate business dispute, and neither the miners nor the townspeople had any faith that outside authorities could arrive in time to prevent the bloodshed. On the morning of the planned gunfight, Matthias made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for his usual evening performance at the Crimson Rose, he moved his piano to the front porch of the saloon and began playing at noon, just as the rival crews were gathering for their confrontation. The music that poured from Matthias's piano that day was unlike anything he had ever played before. It was a complex composition that seemed to blend elements of funeral dirges, church hymns, and lullabies into something that spoke directly to the deepest parts of human nature. The melody carried themes of loss, redemption, forgiveness, and the terrible cost of violence, while the rhythm seemed to synchronize with the heartbeats of everyone who heard it. As the music filled the air, something miraculous began to happen. The armed miners who had been preparing for battle found their weapons feeling impossibly heavy in their hands. Men who had been consumed with rage and the desire for revenge began to remember the families and friends they would leave behind if they died in the street. Most importantly, the artificial divisions between the Sullivan and O'Brien crews began to dissolve as the music reminded everyone that they were all human beings with the same hopes, fears, and need for connection. By the time Matthias finished playing, 2 hours later, the planned gunfight had been forgotten. Instead of drawing weapons, the leaders of both crews were shaking hands and apologizing for the misunderstandings that had brought them to the brink of war. The men who had been ready to kill each other were now working together to find fair solutions to their disputed claims, and the townspeople were celebrating the miracle that had saved their community from destruction. But Matthias's most powerful intervention was yet to come. Victor Blackwood had been watching the piano player's growing influence with increasing unease, and he was beginning to suspect that the mute musician was somehow responsible for the changes that were transforming Dusty Creek from a lawless mining town into something approaching a civilized community. Blackwood's concerns were justified. His criminal empire depended on violence, corruption, and the moral weakness of the people around him. If Matthias continued to use his musical abilities to inspire honesty and peaceful behavior, Blackwood would eventually lose the fear and desperation that allowed him to control the town's economic and political life. The crisis came to a head in March 1872, when Blackwood discovered that several of his most trusted employees had been secretly working to expose his illegal activities to territorial authorities. The betrayals had begun shortly after Matthias started playing at the Crimson Rose, and Blackwood correctly suspected that the piano player's music was somehow inspiring his own men to develop consciences and moral courage. Blackwood's solution was characteristically brutal and direct. He decided to eliminate Matthias before the piano player could completely undermine his authority, and he planned to make the murder look like an accident that would discourage anyone else from interfering with his business operations. On the night of March 15th, 1872, Blackwood and 6 of his most loyal gunmen surrounded Matthias as he finished his evening performance at the Crimson Rose. The saloon had emptied except for Blackwood's men, who had been instructed to prevent anyone from interfering with what was about to happen. "I know what you've been doing," Blackwood told Matthias as the piano player sat calmly at his instrument. "I don't know how you're doing it, but I know you're the reason my men have been growing soft and my business has been falling apart." Matthias looked up at Blackwood with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving in Dusty Creek. He couldn't speak to defend himself, but he didn't seem afraid of the guns that were pointed at him. "You've got some kind of trick with that piano," Blackwood continued. "Maybe you're putting something in the air, or maybe you're just playing songs that make people weak. But whatever you're doing, it ends tonight." Blackwood nodded to his men, who raised their weapons and prepared to fire. But before they could pull their triggers, Matthias's fingers found the piano keys one last time. The music that filled the Crimson Rose Saloon in those final moments was the most powerful composition Matthias had ever created. It was a piece that combined every technique he had developed over years of experimentation, focused and concentrated into a single, overwhelming assault on the psychological defenses of everyone who heard it. The melody spoke of justice and consequence, of the price that must be paid for a lifetime of cruelty and violence. The harmony revealed the pain and suffering that Blackwood and his men had caused to countless innocent people. The rhythm synchronized with the natural frequencies of guilt and shame, amplifying these emotions until they became unbearable. But most powerfully, the music forced each listener to experience the full emotional weight of every cruel act they had ever committed. Blackwood and his gunmen were suddenly overwhelmed with the accumulated agony of all their victims, feeling every moment of terror, pain, and despair they had inflicted over years of criminal activity. The psychological assault lasted only 3 minutes, but its effects were permanent and devastating. When the music stopped, Blackwood and his men were no longer the same people who had entered the saloon that evening. They had been transformed into broken, remorseful individuals who were consumed with the need to confess their crimes and make whatever amends were possible for the suffering they had caused. One by one, Blackwood's gunmen dropped their weapons and walked out of the Crimson Rose, heading directly to Sheriff Morrison's office to turn themselves in. They confessed to every crime they had committed, provided evidence against their associates, and begged for the chance to face justice for their actions. Victor Blackwood himself was found the next morning sitting in his office, writing a detailed confession that documented every illegal activity he had orchestrated during his years of controlling Dusty Creek. He had liquidated all of his assets and was preparing to distribute the money to the families of his victims. When Sheriff Morrison arrived to arrest him, Blackwood was grateful for the opportunity to face punishment for his crimes. The transformation of Dusty Creek was complete within a matter of weeks. The confession of Blackwood and his organization led to a complete housecleaning of the town's government and business community. Honest officials were elected to replace the corrupt ones. Legitimate businesses took over from criminal enterprises, and the atmosphere of fear and violence that had characterized the town for years was replaced by a sense of community and mutual respect. But Matthias Cole was no longer there to witness the changes his music had brought about. On the morning after his confrontation with Blackwood, the piano player had quietly packed his few possessions and left Dusty Creek, moving on to the next place where his unique abilities were needed. For the rest of his life, Matthias traveled throughout the American West, using his musical gifts to bring peace and justice to communities that were plagued by violence and corruption. He never stayed in one place for more than a few months, always moving on before people could become too dependent on his presence or too curious about the source of his power. The pattern was always the same. Matthias would arrive in a troubled town, find work as a piano player in the local saloon or music hall, and begin his nightly performances that gradually transformed the moral and psychological landscape of the community. Violence would decrease, corruption would be exposed, and people would begin treating each other with greater kindness and respect. Some towns experienced dramatic changes within a matter of weeks, while others required months of patient musical therapy before significant improvements became apparent. But in every case, Matthias left behind communities that were healthier, safer, and more just than they had been before his arrival. The legend of the mute piano player who could silence saloons and change hearts spread throughout the frontier, but few people understood the true nature of his abilities. Most assumed that his effects were the result of exceptional musical talent combined with the emotional power of his tragic personal history. Only a handful of people ever suspected that Matthias possessed supernatural abilities that allowed him to manipulate human consciousness through musical vibrations. Those who did understand the truth about Matthias's gift were divided in their opinions about the ethics of what he was doing. Some argued that using psychic abilities to alter people's thoughts and behavior was a form of mind control that violated individual free will, regardless of how benevolent the intentions might be. Others contended that Matthias was simply amplifying people's existing capacity for goodness and moral behavior, helping them overcome the destructive influences of fear, greed, and violence that prevented them from living up to their better natures. Matthias himself seemed to view his abilities as a form of medicine that could heal psychological and spiritual illnesses that conventional treatments couldn't reach. He saw violence, cruelty, and corruption as symptoms of damaged souls that needed healing, and his music was the treatment that could restore people to their natural state of compassion and moral clarity. The philosophical questions raised by Matthias's methods became more complex as his reputation spread and his techniques became more sophisticated. By the 1880s, he had learned to create musical compositions that could implant specific suggestions and behavioral changes that would persist long after the music had stopped. He could essentially reprogram people's personalities, eliminating destructive traits and enhancing positive characteristics with surgical precision. This level of power raised troubling questions about the nature of identity and free will. If Matthias could use his music to make violent people peaceful, dishonest people truthful, and cruel people kind, were the resulting changes authentic expressions of their true nature, or were they artificial constructs imposed by external manipulation? The answer to these questions became critical in 1885, when Matthias encountered a situation that tested the limits of his abilities and forced him to confront the potential dangers of his gift. He had arrived in a small cattle town in Montana that was being terrorized by a gang of killers led by a man named Samuel Black Sam Carver, who had been terrorizing the territory for years with a level of violence and cruelty that seemed to go beyond normal criminal behavior. Carver and his gang were responsible for dozens of murders, countless robberies, and a reign of terror that had left entire communities too afraid to report their crimes or resist their demands. Local law enforcement was either corrupted or intimidated into inaction, and territorial authorities seemed unable to track down the gang or bring them to justice. When Matthias first encountered Black Sam Carver, he discovered something that shook him to his core. Carver's mind was somehow immune to the psychological effects of his music. No matter what compositions Matthias played or how much power he channeled through his piano, Carver remained unchanged, violent, cruel, and completely unrepentant. The explanation for Carver's immunity was both simple and terrifying. The gang leader had suffered brain damage during childhood that had destroyed the neural pathways responsible for empathy, remorse, and moral reasoning. He was literally incapable of feeling guilt or compassion, and his mind couldn't be reached by music that worked by amplifying these emotions. This discovery forced Matthias to confront a fundamental limitation of his abilities. His music could only work with psychological and spiritual material that already existed within his listeners. He could strengthen good impulses and weaken destructive ones, but he couldn't create moral capacity where none existed. Black Sam Carver was beyond redemption because he lacked the basic human qualities that redemption required. The realization that his gift had limits was both humbling and terrifying for Matthias. If there were people who couldn't be reached by his music, then there would always be sources of evil and violence that couldn't be eliminated through psychological manipulation. Some problems would require more direct solutions, even if those solutions involved the same kind of violence that Matthias had spent his life trying to prevent. The confrontation with Black Sam Carver ended in the only way it could. When Matthias realized that his music couldn't change the gang leader's heart, he made the decision to use his abilities in a different way. Instead of trying to reform Carver, he focused his musical power on the gang leader's followers, gradually turning them against their leader and inspiring them to seek justice for the crimes they had committed under his influence. The process took months of careful psychological manipulation, but eventually Carver found himself abandoned by his own men, who turned him over to territorial authorities and testified against him in court. Carver was convicted and executed for his crimes, but his death provided Matthias with little satisfaction. The victory had required him to use his gift as a weapon rather than a healing tool, and he wasn't sure he liked what that said about the true nature of his abilities. The Black Sam Carver incident marked the beginning of a darker period in Matthias's life. He began to question whether his musical interventions were truly making the world a better place, or whether he was simply imposing his own vision of morality on people who had the right to make their own choices, even if those choices were destructive. These doubts were compounded by the growing sophistication of his abilities, which had evolved to the point where he could essentially rewrite people's personalities at will. The power was intoxicating and frightening in equal measure, and Matthias began to worry that he was losing touch with his own humanity in the process of manipulating the humanity of others. The crisis came to a head in 1888, when Matthias realized that he had been unconsciously using his musical abilities to manipulate people in his personal life, not just in his professional work as a force for justice. He had been subtly influencing the thoughts and feelings of everyone around him, ensuring that they would like him, trust him, and support his goals without question. The discovery horrified Matthias because it meant that he had no way of knowing which of his relationships and achievements were authentic and which were the products of psychological manipulation. Had people helped him because they genuinely cared about him and believed in his mission, or because his music had programmed them to respond that way? The uncertainty became unbearable, and Matthias made the painful decision to withdraw completely from human society. He built a small cabin in the remote mountains of Colorado, far from any settlement where his abilities might accidentally affect other people. He continued to play piano, but only for himself, using his music to explore the depths of his own psyche and search for answers to the moral questions that haunted him. Matthias Cole spent the last 15 years of his life in self-imposed isolation, creating musical compositions that no other human ear would ever hear. These final works were said to be his most beautiful and powerful, pieces that explored themes of redemption, responsibility, and the price of great power. He died in 1903 at the age of 52, found at his piano with his fingers still resting on the keys. The last piece he had been working on was an unfinished composition titled The Silent Voice, a haunting melody that seemed to capture the loneliness and moral complexity of a man who had possessed the power to change hearts, but had lost faith in his right to use it. The legacy of Matthias Cole remains controversial more than a century after his death. The communities he touched during his traveling years continued to benefit from the psychological changes he had wrought, with lower rates of violence and higher levels of social cooperation persisting for generations. Towns that had been notorious for lawlessness became models of civic virtue, and the children and grandchildren of people who had heard his music seemed to inherit enhanced capacities for empathy and moral reasoning. But questions about the ethics of his methods persist. Modern psychologists and philosophers continue to debate whether Matthias's musical interventions represented a form of therapy that healed damaged souls, or a type of mind control that violated the fundamental principles of individual autonomy and free will. Some argue that Matthias was a pioneer in understanding the connection between music and consciousness, a man who discovered scientific principles that could be used to treat psychological disorders and social problems that conventional approaches couldn't address. Others contend that he was a dangerous individual who used supernatural abilities to impose his personal moral code on unwilling subjects, regardless of how benevolent his intentions might have been. The truth, as is often the case with questions of power and responsibility, probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Matthias Cole was a man who had been given an extraordinary gift through extraordinary suffering, and he spent his life trying to use that gift to reduce the kind of violence and cruelty that had destroyed his own family. His methods were questionable and his power was potentially dangerous, but his motivations were rooted in a genuine desire to make the world a more just and peaceful place. The piano he left behind his mountain cabin was eventually discovered by hikers and donated to a museum in Denver, where it remains on display today. Visitors often comment on the strange sense of peace they feel when looking at the instrument, and some claim to hear faint echoes of melodies that seem to speak directly to their hearts and consciences. But the piano never sounds the same when other musicians try to play it. The magic that once transformed saloons and changed lives died with Matthias Cole, leaving behind only the memories of what one man with an impossible gift had been able to accomplish in a world that desperately needed healing. The mute piano player who had made saloons silent had indeed possessed the power to speak without words, to touch souls without physical contact, and to change hearts without violence. His music had been more than entertainment. It had been a form of spiritual medicine that could heal the psychological wounds that turned good people into cruel ones. But in the end, Matthias Cole's greatest composition wasn't any of the pieces he played in saloons and music halls throughout the American West. It was the symphony of changed lives that continued to resonate long after his fingers had stopped moving across the keys, a legacy of peace and redemption that proved one man's gift could echo through generations. Whether that legacy was the product of supernatural power or simply the natural result of exceptional talent and compassion, The story of Matthias Cole serves as a reminder that music has always possessed the ability to touch parts of the human soul that words